What's the role of the coach in maximizing what these players could get from a lack of safety? The number one thing that was two big things that came out of it. One was coach who provides role clarity. Coach provides the type of feedback that says, yep, it's not safe around here, but if you want to get picked, this is what you need to do. And I'm going to help you do it.
Welcome to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. I hope you enjoy. Good afternoon, Dr. Jamie Taylor. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Hey, Noah, thanks for having me on. It's an absolute pleasure.
I want to jump right in, and can you tell us a bit about your academic background and also your research interests?
It's funny for me hearing, I suppose, people referring to me as an academic, because I suppose I am a practitioner, I am a coach, and look, my background is as teacher, coach, particularly rugby coach and coach developer, I suppose I know there's a lot made of distinctions between practice and academia, and I suppose what I've tried to do with my life is to make sure that the academic work I do reflects my practice, and my practice reflects my academic work. So, and people don't necessarily like the label very much, but I very much see myself as a pracademic, somebody who.
I learned that word recently. I learned that from Dr. Harry Carson.
Yeah, and Howie's a really good example of somebody who also takes that kind of approach. But and look, I'll get around to answering your actual question there. My background is, I suppose, running alongside my coaching. I completed a PhD going on 4 years ago now. That PhD focused on talent development and coaching in talent development particularly. And since then, I've had the pleasure of working with lots of people, mainly similar sorts of routes of people who are doing academic work, or at least trying to advance research-informed practice in high-performance sports. So since then, I've got research interests that go predominantly across coaching, talent development, coach development, and other high-performance domains, really. One of the things that I try and do is make sure I don't get too narrow.
So what I want to go into is kind of two different topics to cover. Firstly, psychological safety, because that's kind of the first bit of research I was reading and I came across you, and then going into talent development pathways afterwards. So to start with the psychological safety, it's a term that's getting more and more popular in recent years. But to start with, can you explain what is psychological safety and maybe talk about some of the past research, the history of the psychological safety research, before we get into some of the papers that you've co-authored?
Yeah, and look, I'm smiling because psychological safety is increasingly getting redefined and defined in lots of other ways. So it's much like lots of other psychological ideas. It tends to morph a bit, and it's very difficult to pin down. And that's and the problem with that is that, particularly with my lens on this, coach and high performance sports, I'm looking at it going, "Ooh, it's really, really important that we get some conceptual clarity, because the slight tweaks in conceptual clarity can make a big difference." Now, instead of offering a word for word definition, I'm going to refer to the work of Amy Edmondson. And Amy Edmondson has a long history in working with the concepts of psychological safety, and has done some tremendous work in validating ideas and also building a significant evidence base in a particular context in the business world. And for that reason, this concept has gathered a lot of attention and has become very popular for a good reason, because there is an awful lot of evidence for it in the business world. There are two ends to latest definition. One being a perception that I can speak up around here, that I can say what I think without fear of consequence for saying what I think. Second end of it, and perhaps certainly more controversial from a sports point of view, is the lack of fear of consequence, or a lack of fear of judgment that might be conferred on me for my performance. Now, we can get into the nitty gritty of what that means in sports, because the first one might actually be very appealing. There's not that many situations where we might go, look, probably don't want to speak up now, or offer your opinion. But then the second part of it goes, oh, how many situations in sport are there where I can be free of fear of judgment or fear of consequence for my performance? And the concept gets even more slippy, if you like, because some people have conceived it as an individual level construct. It's my feeling. Others have seen it as a group level construct. So it's how everybody around here feels. And again, that's where things get tricky, because is psychological safety something between me and my coach? Is it something that I experience as part of a training group? Or is it my own personal perception of what's going on around me? And those things make a very, very big difference, particularly in sports, because of the context, and because that context shows up all of those little edges around a psychological construct.
Interesting. So because of that lack of clarity or consistency throughout the definitions, it leaves a lot of people can be talking and thinking they're talking about the same thing, but actually potentially be not talking about the same thing at all, just because we're not clear on what psychological safety is. There's not a universal, let's say, agreement on what that term means, which is often the case, especially when you're trying to really talk about a topic in detail, is you have to be sure that you're actually your definitions align in terms of what you're talking about. Otherwise, you're basically going to be talking past each other and without even realizing it. Okay. So yeah, I want to really focus on that, the value or the awareness that we have to bring to this idea of psychological safety within performance contexts. So the first paper I want to go into was titled Psychological Safety in High Performance Sport, Contextually Applicable, as a question. So to start with, can you talk about what some of those key findings were in that paper as it kind of pertains to what you were just talking about, as how it kind of becomes a slippery slope in a high performance context?
Well, look, in that paper as a whole, and it was we didn't collect data in that paper. It was a conceptual paper. We laid out a position that said we're increasingly hearing of this concept in sport. And in lots of situations, it's being adopted by organizations without a lot of critical thinking going on. It's almost we need this. So what we did were a couple of things. One, we looked at the evidence base in sport at that time, of which, as we highlight in the paper, it's nearly non-existent, particularly in high performance sport, where there has been a paper in NCAA college basketball, but it was put into the paper with lots of other factors going on as well. Now, and then we said, right, well, what are the characteristics of different high performance sports environments? And obviously, like we've just laid out, there's lots of differences. So, for example, if I'm let's say I'm a cycling coach and I'm working with an athlete and I'm going to compete twice a year, and I don't actually pick whether that athlete competes or not, then suddenly the judgments conferred by performance might be significantly lower. If I'm a rugby coach or a team sports coach, or let's say I'm an NFL coach, I'm the person as the coach who decides whether that person, that athlete, starts on a Sunday afternoon versus the other 49 people who are in the locker room, and then the many millions of people who would like to be in that shirt in the first place. Now, and that's before you start getting on to the idea that, well, look, if I'm playing in the NFL, then I'm being watched by millions of people around the world. That all of those people are going to be many of those people are going to be offering their opinions on social media based on how I perform. And suddenly the ideas in the construct start getting a bit more, certainly, I think they're more than a little bit flaky. And the reason, but it's the context, not necessarily psychological safety. What we outline is saying, look, let's think about this logically. Here's an idea with lots of strong evidence in a particular context. Now let's compare that to the needs of this context, and suddenly things start breaking apart, I think.
So you're saying that part of that title was that contextually applicable as a question, because you're saying, is it contextually applicable that, if one of the fundamental pieces of psychological safety is that you're not in fear of your consequences for your performance? Well, if you say NFL, rugby, or any sport where there's a coach that makes a decision, it doesn't seem rational that the coach isn't going to base the decision on performance, unless that coach doesn't care about their own job and the overall, satisfying the fans and the organization and the success of the organization. That's my understanding kind of that contextually applicable. Not saying that in other domains might be applicable, but in some of these high performance scenarios, it doesn't necessarily work when you apply just a more logical thought process to it.
Oh, completely. And look, and even if you do pick somebody, there's however many other people who aren't the 11 players on the pitch. Or in your context, there's a lot of people who don't make the cut.
Mm-hmm.
Those people have to fly home without any money in their pocket. Now, that means you are being judged based on your performance. And that's, for me, where the concept doesn't really match up or with the reality of what's going on. And it could, however, let's say if you and I were working at Google and our job is to fail fast, fail quick, and that we're looking for just creative innovation on new software design, well, suddenly that you can see how a fear of consequence for poor performance probably wouldn't be that helpful. But we're not in software design. We're trying to help people perform at the highest level of sport.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, if you have a great new software idea, or you just want to kind of mess around and I had this coding idea and I want to just build this, it could turn out to be, 20 years ago, it would have been Google Calendar or whatever that would have been. But that is very different than getting your spot on the team, making the cut, whatever that situation is. So yeah, that's where the context plays such a big role. And if we're not careful about applying these, concepts to the context that we work in, live in, or interested in, then we can start setting almost like false expectations. And that can also be dangerous, because if you're an athlete and you think, I only want to be around people that don't judge me based on my performance, it's going to be hard to compete in any sort of elite level field. And
look, to build on that idea as well, let's say you had Howie Carson on the podcast a couple of months ago. Well, where Howie is one of the world's best is in the idea is working with the idea of skill refinement. By the same token, you don't want people perceiving consequences for poor performance at the early stages of skill refinement either. But there's a big difference between that context and trying to make the cut in one of the majors. And again, it's like this. I think the other thing that confounds this discussion as well is the idea of safety more broadly, because obviously there are lots of concerns regarding well-being, both of athletes and general population, absolutely rightly so. But there's lots of things being tied up with the concept of safety. And when we say, right, we're not all saying the same thing, well, conceptually, in academic research, we're not all saying the same thing. And if I go and have a chat when I pick my daughter up from school and I say, right, safety, that means something completely different to everybody that's around me. And all of those kinds of things are being wrapped up with how these ideas are being used in practice.
Mm. And going also back to that conversation with Dr. Carson that I had, was even as a skill develops, you need pressure to kind of stress test if that's going to hold up under pressure. So you can't create any sort of pressure environment where there's no consequences, which I've also talked to William Lowe about pressure training. And so if you want to, at the beginning stages, you want to be in a safe environment where I can mess up and I can practice my golf swing technique, or I can work on a new whatever sporting dynamic context you're in. But as that progresses, you don't just want to be dropped in at the deep end in a super high level competition. You need some gradual progressions to build up to that. And in order to feel some sort of pressure, you have to care. And if you're caring, it's because there's probably something on the line. It's maybe not a lot on the line, but something's on the line. And if you're only concerned about, well, I have to not fear any consequences of my performance, then you're never really going to be able to refine that skill to the next level that's going to help you really perform at the highest level.
Oh, and there's an interesting body of literature that looks at pressure training as part of the training session. And one of the approaches that's advocated for that is the need for people to perceive realistic consequence. It can't be something that's artificially generated. And look, I think the other thing to point out here is that it might not necessarily be a consequence, but it's judgment is the thing that we're probably referring to with psychological safety. But these ideas are absolutely, if we talk about it in the real world and not the abstract, well, yes, of course, that idea is wrapped up there, that we want people to help pressure-proof people for serious pressure, whether that pressure is in competition or with my talent development hat on and my coaching hat on, the players that I'm working with at the moment, we've got to help them develop for the rigors of elite sport. We need to offer them a challenge-full journey that helps them get them there. And some of that challenge-full journey likely will be the experience of a lack of safety, psychological anyway.
And that kind of brings me, that second paper was titled Tough Love, Impactful Caring Coaching in Psychologically Unsafe Environments. So building on that first paper, we just touched on contextually applicable, how or does psychological safety apply in a high performance context. Can you now touch on a bit the findings from this Tough Love paper?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a really, really interesting paper, this, where we took 7 rugby players who had played international age group rugby in across a few different countries and had progressed to playing senior international rugby union, which is the highest level of the sport. And we took 8 players who had played international age group rugby, so around about at the same sort of time period, who had then fallen out of the professional game. So you've got a group of some of the best players in the world and a group of players who had looked good and then fallen away. Now, a few important things that fall out of this. One, in relation to psychological safety, was that their journeys were consistent. There was a consistent perception of low psychological safety throughout their development. There were instances where there was perception of more psychological safety. For example, some players got loaned or sent to lower league teams, equivalent of minor leagues in baseball, where you get sent out. Right, I am easily good enough to get picked here. I'm not going to get deselected. And in some cases, that led if that was over an extended period of time, they were going, look, I'm just getting very comfortable here. No, nothing's really. I need a lack of psychological safety to really motivate me every now and again. And by the same token, some players, particularly when they started getting engaged in international rugby for the first time, the lack of safety there, the level of competition to get into the team, really wore them out. And there was almost a relief when they were going back to playing professional club rugby, still playing on television every week, still in front of lots of people watching them. But the lower likelihood of deselection enabled them to almost recover from periods of less safety. The key differentiator was their ability to respond adaptively to a lack of safety, to really benefit from it, and for it to motivate and drive their continued improvement. Now, the other element of that paper was we looked at what's the role of the coach in this. What's the role of the coach in maximizing what these players could get from a lack of safety? The number one thing that was 2 big things that came out of it. One was coach who provides role clarity. coach provides the type of feedback that says, yep, it's not safe around here, but if you want to get picked, this is what you need to do. And I'm going to help you do it. Second bit was about the way in which the coach interacted with players. And that's why it's called Tough Love, because they offered a range of harder interpersonal approaches that were more robust, more direct, and a range of softer ones that offered support that helped them navigate things emotionally. And it's interesting that tough love is often used as a euphemism basically for bullying. Well, we were going here, well, actually, it's the very opposite. This was the type of support that these players wanted and needed if they were going to progress. And where that support was absent, players often said, look, we had nothing, or somebody was just trying to make me feel better about me not getting picked. And that just made things worse. I needed somebody to say, this isn't good enough, this isn't good enough, this is what I need from you if you're going to get into that team.
And I think that's very different. Very, very key point is that's different than just saying you suck and you're bad, you're not good enough, and you just leave it at that. Because then you're not going back to, I think, use role clarity and helping understand. There's a difference between just demeaning and saying someone's not to the level and painting a picture as to this is why you're not where you want to be, and for me to consider you, or for you to get to the point where you want to be, this is what you need to be doing. I think it's a very important difference, that tough love or direct communication, it's not a matter of just bringing someone down. It's saying, okay, here's the reality of the situation. Here's the rationale as to why, if I'm the one choosing, why I've made this decision. And these are the things that are in your control that you can do to influence that going forward.
Oh, completely. And also what I'm really not saying here is that a coach needs to do that all the time. One of the things that I would strongly advocate for, and it's in a lot of the papers that I've written, is the idea of a professional judgment decision-making approach, where we need to deploy a range of different approaches as a coach, going from do this, do that, to how do you feel about that, what's going on for you, or nothing at all. But you need to align your intentions with, you need to align your methods with your intentions. What is it you want to achieve here? And that means that coaching, we're talking about how we might interact with coach, athlete, or anywhere else. What we're really talking about is what's most appropriate in this context under these circumstances. Absolutely.
And I think also going back to the conversation with Dr. Carson was, it depends was a term that we used a lot, right? There's a lot of it depends that doesn't mean we don't know what we're doing. It's the right tool in the right situation is important, and the context matters. You can't just always provide tough love. You can't always just provide encouraging words. But from a performance perspective, I do think that's important. Is okay, interesting to hear you say that the players were also seeking out that I needed that guidance and structure, not just somebody telling me, oh, don't worry, it'll get better, because that's not really going to help them get anywhere, right? That's not saying that there's not a time and a place for that, but from getting from point A to point B, that doesn't really help move the needle necessarily.
Oh, completely. And I would use the idea of it depends a lot. And I suppose that we both owe that to a colleague of a mutual colleague called Professor Dave Collins. But returning to where I started, which is one of the reasons that I always say, look, I've got a foot in academe and a foot in practice, is that I think if you approach problems purely from the literature, often the nuance and the contextual applicability of different constructs can get lost, because unless you're applying these ideas or applying ideas day in, day out, almost testing them as you go along in practice, it doesn't really show the edges up of different things. And that's where that it depends idea comes from, because everything in coaching is contextual.
To kind of summarize, are there any other pieces on psychological safety that you want to touch on, like important points that you want to convey? At the end, we're going to come back with some general recommendations or I think points to reflect on for coaches and athletes. But before we move on to some other topics that are not directly related to psychological safety or indirectly are there any things we haven't touched on yet that you want to reemphasize?
No, look, I think that the bit that I would really emphasize here is that the need for to be really clear what it is that we're talking about when you start having conversations about psychological safety. The other thing that I think is probably coming out of a lot of the research now, and may well be coming out in future work, is the idea that it's probably a good idea that we start getting a bit more fine-grained on this, because there clearly is something really important going on, as per our conversation about skill refinement. When do I want to perceive a level of judgment, of fear of pressure, of fear of consequence versus not? And I think there's something really important to get stuck into there. And I don't necessarily think it's useful to put that idea next to voice behavior, because lots of people would see psychological safety as purely being about voice, the ability to speak up and offer my view. And you'll notice that a lot of our conversation here hasn't talked about that. And I think, again, there are potential boundary conditions of not offering your point of view. So I don't think you necessarily want your caddy offering a robust point of view about unless it's an emergency situation on the 18th green. But you absolutely want them being direct and straightforward in the debrief of a competition. But look, put that to one side. I think there's probably a bit more nuance on the performance side of things that needs to be fleshed out. And if it is, I think it could be very useful for coaches.
Yeah. And I think for me, the take-home message is, if there's any listeners that if you hear or read or talk about psychological safety, it's yes, but think of it in the context that you are in. And if you're someone who's talking from performance perspective, or not so much, let's say, a personal life or office setting, maybe it's applicable for you. It depends, but to be critical and not think that just because it applies in a certain scenario that it should or can apply in a performance setting.
Completely.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to the Golf Performance newsletter. This is where I share written, audio, and video content designed to help golfers take their game to the next level. All the relevant links from today's episode and to the newsletter can be found below. See you next time.